we're probably going to go to 120. That's insane. That's just an amazing rate of discovery in a place that's lost 90% of its natural habitat. So in many ways, we're living in an era similar to the second half of the 19th century, when the great explorer and naturalists went around the tropical world and found all these species. So why biodiversity? I'm going to run through this quickly. You all know it. The intrinsic value, the moral imperative, the aesthetic value, the cultural value. Increasingly, we're understanding the economic value of species. I'm particularly interested in ecotourism as a mechanism for fostering both biodiversity conservation and livelihoods in local communities. And then all of these ecosystem services that derive from biodiversity. I'm not going to go through them here. I think you all know them very well. Increasingly, we're seeing that biodiversity underpins the provision of ecosystem services. These ecosystem services derive from biodiversity, and all of us want to achieve human well-being. Without these ecosystem services that come from the biodiversity, it's going to be hard to have any human well-being. This really started to be discussed seriously with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. That's been the subject of a lot of different books. This is one that Jeff McNeely and I did a few years ago with other authors. And this really peaked in terms of comprehensive assessment with the TEEB study, which was launched at the last meeting of the CBD in Nagoya. Pavan Sukhdev. Pavan is here. He's actually going to be, after this event ends, I invite all of you to our event on the Global Conservation Fund, which is going to be just around the corner in the Delicias restaurant, and Pavan will be one of the speakers there. And this program that's been in existence now for a few years at the World Bank, Wealth Accounting and Evaluation of Ecosystem Services, which is very exciting and is being tested out in a number of pilot projects. Now, I was at Rio Plus 20. I know a bunch of you were at Rio Plus 20 as well. Everybody was saying, oh, it's a big failure. Well, I don't really agree. Yeah, the government part was fairly tedious as usual, but so many interesting things were happening in the side events. I think there were about 6,000 side events altogether. I actually think there were some really amazing things that came out of that meeting, and I think as people look back, they're going to see that it was a real landmark, a real, I won't say tipping point, but it certainly was a very important meeting that didn't get yet the credit that it deserves. In particular, I'd like to focus on the World Bank's 50-50 commitment. They aimed at getting 50 companies in 50 countries to commit to natural capital accounting. They wound up with 60 countries and 90-something corporations, including some big ones. That alone, for me, was a great success. And we're seeing more and more that natural capital, renewable natural capital, needs to be central to long-term sustainable development. And I don't care whether you call it green economies or healthy sustainable economies or just plain old sustainable development. Biodiversity, ecosystem services, our natural capital have to be, not a side consideration, have to be central to all efforts to develop sustainably. So what are the threats? Again, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because you know them all. I think the biggest threat out there is industrial agriculture, whether it's soy or sugarcane or oil palm. This clears large areas of forest, continues to clear large areas of forest in many parts of the tropical world. Slash and burn agriculture is another issue. It works in areas of very low human population density, in areas of high population density. It doesn't. Cattle raising in many parts of the world. It's certainly a big problem in parts of Madagascar where I work. Logging of tropical forests. I don't believe it's sustainable. I'd love to have somebody convince me that it is. I've been in many, many places where this is taking place and it doesn't even come close to being sustainable. I think it's a 19th century activity that doesn't belong in today's world, and these forests need to be conserved for the many other values that they have. Firewood and charcoal production, big problem in many places. This is charcoal production using natural spiny desert vegetation in southern Madagascar. Huge hydro projects flooding large areas. This is the Guri Dam in Venezuela. Mining, this is gold mining at the edge of the Pantanal in Brazil. This is all over the tropics in a major way. And this very insidious threat of bushmeat hunting, especially in the forests of West and Central Africa, but also in many other tropical regions as well. This is very unsustainable, and it impacts even our closest living relatives, like the great apes. Their meat sells for higher prices in many of the markets of Central Africa, higher prices than fish or meat or chicken. The trade in various species, especially in Southeast Asia, is a source of food. Turtles are heavily impacted. And also the increasing trade in pets. This is a plowshare tortoise from western Madagascar. This species is down to about 200 or 300 individuals in the wild, and yet it's being sold on Chinese websites and pet trade, I think these are going for about $5,000 each. A big one will go anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 if you can find them. And invasive species. This is one of the most famous of the invasive species, the mongoose, which has been introduced all over the place, particularly in the Caribbean. It's become so much a part of the fauna in some of these places. This is on the island of St. Kitts in the Caribbean, where they were attracting it as a tourist attraction by putting out food for it. So it's already an accepted part of the biota in some of these places. And invasive plants, which don't perhaps get as much attention sometimes as invasive animals, but they can be very, very serious and can have major economic impacts and impacts on biodiversity as well. And we have global climate change, which we're all talking about all the time. Of course, a major threat, but in many ways, if you look at red, not reached potential yet, but it could also be a major opportunity for us as we look to the future. I'm not going to talk any more about this today, but this is something that I think all of us have been tracking and hopeful that it's going to become more of a mechanism for us in the future. So we're in an extinction crisis, we're losing species, we're losing forests and habitats, and in the process we're seeing the erosion of critical ecosystem services. The loss is irreversible, and just using the primate example, the last analysis we did, we're engaged in another one right now, but the last analysis as part of the global mammal assessment of IUCN found that about 1 in every 3 primates were in either the critically endangered or endangered category. So we've always felt the need to be strategic and to set priorities based on the best available science. We recognize that all biodiversity is important. All nations should do everything possible to conserve their living resources, but some places just need bonus points, more attention than others, because the biodiversity that we're trying to save is not necessarily perfectly evenly distributed over the face of the planet, and a lot of it is concentrated in a relatively small area, much of which has been heavily impacted by human activities. And as it turns out, these areas also happen to have some of the highest ecosystem service values, and they're therefore very valuable in terms of human well-being, which does provide us with a bunch of win-win situations. We use 3 main categories of setting priorities: megadiversity countries, the 18 richest countries on Earth that account for about 2/3 of all biodiversity. I'm not going to go into them tonight, but suffice it to say that we have representatives here from 2 of the 2 richest megadiversity countries on Earth, Brazil and Indonesia. I'd rather concentrate on hotspots, which is the main mechanism that we have, and then high biodiversity wilderness areas, which I'll say a little bit about. Hotspots are all about prioritizing areas of high irreplaceability as measured by endemic species and very high degree of threat. It's a concept that was first developed by Norman Myers back in 1988 and 1990. We picked up on it in 1989 and have been revising it ever since. And conveniently, the MacArthur Foundation also picked up on it in 1989 and was a major supporter, a major private supporter of conservation for over a decade in terms of focusing very closely on these areas. We're now up to, from the original 10, we're now up to 35. The most recent addition was in the eastern forests of Australia, which we haven't even announced publicly yet. The original extent was about 16% of Earth's land surface. We've lost close to 90% over the last 100 years or so. We're down to about 2.3%. That's an area about the size of India or the 5 largest American states for the Americans in the audience. In that area, we have packed as endemic species at least 50% of all plants as endemics, more than 40% of all vertebrates as endemics. And if you want to look at the most threatened species, using again the IUCN Red List, more than 80% of birds and mammals, and these figures are a few years old, I think it's actually much higher now, or considerably higher, and 90% of amphibians are packed into this hotspot, remaining hotspot area. That's a pretty high concentration of extinction risk. Just a few points about the hotspots. They're not just tropical forests. We're not just looking at species richness or endemism. We're looking also at concentrations of endemism at higher taxonomic levels, like genera and families. And in many ways, they help us to conserve deep lineages and evolutionary history as well. I'm going to say a little bit about Madagascar, because I spent a good part of my life there now over the past few years, over the past decade or so. It's the largest oceanic island, the 4th largest island on Earth, but the largest of the oceanic islands, about the size of, a little larger than France, a little smaller than Texas, 400 kilometers off the east coast of Africa, and isolated from India for about 90 million years and Africa for about 160 million years. So everything there, almost everything there has evolved largely in isolation. Great diversity of habitats, tropical rainforest, these wonderful dry forest formations, spiny desert in the southern part of the country, and a whole bunch of unique, very localized other formations. Plant diversity is amazingly high, about 15,000 species, 80% of which are endemic. And this is almost as much in all of North America, north of Mexico, which is about 30 times larger. Same for reptiles. This diversity is comparable to all of North America and north of Mexico, and it's well over 90% endemic. It includes some amazing radiations, like the largest radiation of chameleons in the world. And amphibians, all of them frogs. There are no salamanders, caecilians. There are 244 species known, but we may at least double, based on what's already in museum collections waiting to be described, we may double the total amphibian diversity of that country. But of course, what attracts everyone to Madagascar, especially me, are the lemurs, an incredible array of primates that range from the smallest of all living primates, Madabat's mouse lemur, it's about 30 grams, up to the Indri, which is the largest of the living species. Fantastic animal, I think one of my favorite animals on the planet. Diadem sea fox, another form of rose sea fox from the southern spiny desert, and of course the strangest of all primates, which has been isolated from other primates for at least 40 million years, the ii. And if you think the adults look strange, this is what the baby looks like. And I want to emphasize this point about endemic families and endemic genera. This is really a very high priority for conservation. This is something that Jonathan Bailey and the Zoological Society of London have also focused on, those species that are unique at very high taxonomic levels. If you look at Madagascar, you've got 25 families of plants, higher plants and vertebrates endemic to that region. That's a very high percentage. Genera, 478 genera endemic to Madagascar. That's almost double the next highest hotspot on the list. And of course, the lemurs, again, are an example of this. 5 endemic families, 15 genera, 103 species, 100% endemic. That's about 1/3 of whole families of primates on this one island. Birds, 5 endemic families. This is one of the ground rollers. This is one of the mesites. Again, it's a very, very high level of endemism at the family level. Unfortunately, Madagascar is also a champion in terms of habitat loss. Our own species arrived there about 2,000, maybe 2,500 years ago, and has made a pretty good mess of things since then, between slash and burn agriculture, cattle pasture, and a number of other practices that have not been particularly sustainable. The country has the worst erosion I've seen anywhere on Earth, worse than Haiti. There's less habitat, natural habitat remaining in Haiti, but for some reason Madagascar's erosion is just staggering. A very large portion of the country looks like this. Every year the rivers run red with eroded soil. A few decades ago, the World Bank was estimating that they were losing $100 million of potential, several $100 million of potential every year. But I think it's only gotten worse since then. Hunting, we didn't think hunting was so bad initially. Recent studies have shown that it's much more serious than we expected. Impacts even these animals, the Indri. This animal is like the panda in terms of its flagship value, in terms of an ecotourism destination. Just, it doesn't occur in captivity anywhere. You go to you want to see it, you have to go to Madagascar. It's actually easy to see, and unfortunately, it's getting hunted as well. One of these lemurs, if you look at the long-term value, is probably worth millions of dollars to the country, and yet they're being killed for food, especially since the breakdown in the political system there a few years ago. We estimate that more than 90% has already been lost. What remains is about 50 to 60,000 square kilometers. That's about 2 or 3 New Jerseys. I'm not sure what it compares to in terms of European countries, but some of the smaller ones. We just did another red listing workshop there in July. We came out with really a staggering number of critically endangered and endangered species. You look at the 3 categories of threat, the 3 highest categories, critical, endangered, and vulnerable, we're looking at 91%. This is the highest percentage of any larger vertebrate group that we've come up with so far. So it's pretty scary. And Madagascar shows what we can lose, what we have lost already in a relatively short period of time. There was this is a giant lemur, about 100 pounds, that had like a koala. And there was a whole array of giant lemurs that disappeared anywhere from a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand years ago, including one down here, Archaeoindus, that grew to be larger than an adult male gorilla. So this is a staggering loss in a relatively short period of time that indicates that extinction spasms are a reality even in recent times. So many of us consider Madagascar to be the highest priority biodiversity hotspot. We also have a focus on what we call high biodiversity wilderness areas, where the hotspots are 80–90% gone. There are also some areas out there that are also high biodiversity, but in relatively good shape. We documented these in a book called Wilderness a few years back. If you're interested in a copy, let me know and I'll send it to you free of charge. The main ones that we identified in terms of these high biodiversity wilderness areas were the Amazon, Congo, Yamamapani woodland of southern Africa, the island of New Guinea, and the North American deserts, which are by far the richest desert regions and the richest desert region in the world. These areas occupy a slightly larger surface of the planet than the hotspots, about almost 3 times as much, 6.1%, but still a pretty small percentage. The most striking example of this is the Guiana Shield region, the world's largest and most pristine tropical rainforest, basically in the borderlands between Brazil, Guyana, Suriname, French Guiana, Venezuela, and a little bit of Colombia. And these are really a spectacular area where there's still a chance to protect a very large extent of tropical forest. So the bottom line is that the hotspots and the high biodiversity wilderness areas, in our opinion, not everyone agrees, but in our opinion, they're the top priority in terrestrial biodiversity conservation. And if we fail in these areas, we're going to lose a very significant portion of the world's terrestrial biodiversity, regardless of how successful we are everywhere else. As it turns out, these areas, these hotspots, are also important for many other reasons. They're areas where many of our most important commodities are grown. They overlap strongly with the Vavilov centers, which I think most of you are familiar with, the centers of diversity of those critically important cultivated plants that we depend on for our survival. And they happen to have very high ecosystem service values for the poorest of the poor. So they're critically important in so many different ways. And interestingly, a study that we just published a few months ago, they're also tremendously important for human cultural diversity. We looked at the 6,900 languages that are still spoken in the world. It's a good indicator of human cultural diversity. And we found that almost 74% of these, including the vast majority of those spoken by a few hundred or a few thousand people, are concentrated in these same areas that are priorities for biodiversity conservation. So if you're interested in indigenous people, there's a very strong overlap of interest with the areas that are important for biodiversity, and these people, in fact, are our best partners in many places for achieving conservation results. Now, the hotspots, although they're small, and the wilderness areas, although they're a small percentage, they're still relatively large areas. What are the high priority sites? There are several mechanisms now in place that are really important for site-specific conservation. There's the process of the key biodiversity areas. This was discussed at a workshop here a few days ago, and this process is well underway in strong collaboration with IUCN. This is just an example of one of the regions where these KBA assessments have been carried out in the Upper Guinea region of West Africa. And then we have the Alliance for Zero Extinctions, the AZE sites. And I'd like to invite you all to an event tomorrow afternoon. I think it's at 6:30. Yeah. That's going to talk more about these AZE sites. These are critically important in extinction avoidance. They're basically the single sites that are the only home for critically endangered and endangered species. If you lose that one site, that species, or sometimes a host of species, go along with it. And I'm happy to say now there's a joint task force of the Species Survival Commission and the Parks Commission that's working very closely on this, co-chaired by Tom Brooks and by Stephen Woodley. Okay, now to finish up, just a few thoughts about the GEF. What's it done? Where should it go with biodiversity in the future? I know Gustavo's going to talk more about this, but just wanted to say a little bit about what I think some of the priorities are and recognize some of the great accomplishments that the GEF has had. It was originally conceived as the funding mechanism for the CBD, but also the other two conventions to emerge from Rio 92, which I still think is the greatest environmental meeting in history. I was there, Gustavo was there, Braulio was there, Claudio was there, many people still around who were there, it's not that long ago. And also the Montreal Protocol. The GEF has been the biggest funder for biodiversity conservation over the past 30 years. The numbers most recent numbers I've seen are about 3.1 billion spent on biodiversity, leveraging about 9 billion, and I guess for the last couple of years we've been doing about 250 million per year. We also have now, thanks to the success of the meeting in Nagoya a couple of years ago, in accessing benefit sharing mechanism, and I understand that GEF has already established the Nagoya Protocol Implementation Fund as a pilot. I think we have a few countries to go before we reach the 50, right? I don't know what the count is at right now, but I think we're getting close. No, we're not getting close. Okay. Might be a while yet, so that money will be sitting there for a while yet. And of course, we have the all-important Aichi targets for biodiversity, which I think are very, very impressive. And while we're talking about impressive, I just want to put in a picture of my very good friend Braulio. We could not have had a better person chosen to run the CBD. There's no one who knows that convention inside and out, and the good parts, the bad parts, better than Braulio. So Braulio, we're absolutely delighted that you've taken over, and we're going to do everything possible to help you in any way that we can. And here are the 20 targets. So you can't see them, and I'm not going to read them. I just want to focus on two of them, my two favorites. Target 12, the extinction of known threatened species has been prevented, which is basically a zero extinction target, which is quite amazing that that was approved by the governments of the world. And that the future of really success in achieving that objective by 2020 is going to depend on a very close collaboration with the Red List. And target 11, we've increased the target now. We have 13% in the terrestrial realm protected. We're increasing that now to 17, which is a little, not terribly ambitious. And